3 Black Hawk helicopters dropped out of a clear Idaho sky without warning, and the windows of Cascade Valley Medical Center shook like the building itself was afraid. 6 armed soldiers in full combat gear hit the trauma bay doors before the rotors stopped spinning, weapons up, boots loud on linoleum, a dying man on a stretcher between them, bleeding through every bandage they had. The charge nurse screamed for security. The attending physician pressed himself against the wall, and then the commander, dust still on his jacket, jaw set like granite, swept the room with one hard look and shouted 3 words that stopped everyone cold. "Where is Beacon?" The woman stocking gloves into supply alcove slowly set down the box in her hands. "Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel's fire is the stories nobody tells. Out loud finally get told. Every single week, we bring you cinematic drama that will leave your jaw on the floor. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. You will not want to look away. The supply alcove on the east side of the trauma unit was not a place anyone paid attention to, which was exactly why Nora Calloway had chosen it. It sat between the linen closet and a defunct medication room that nobody had bothered to repurpose, barely wide enough for a rolling cart and one person standing sideways. The overhead light buzzed slightly. The shelving was metal, industrial, organized with a precision that no one had asked for and no one had noticed. Nora kept the IV supplies sorted by gauge, the wound care dressings separated by absorption level. The chest tube kits double-checked every shift because she had once found an incomplete kit during a code and decided she would never let that happen again, not on any floor she worked. Nobody at Cascade Valley Medical Center in Kettler, Montana knew that about her. Nobody had asked. She had been a float nurse for 22 months. That meant she was assigned wherever the staffing gaps were, which in practice meant she was wherever nobody else wanted to be, the understaffed overnight on the med-surg floor, the weekend chaos in the emergency annex, trauma bay when one of the regular nurses called out sick, and the charge nurse needed warm hands rather than skilled ones. She pushed carts. She stocked shelves. She completed the task lists that real nurses were too busy or too important to finish, and she did it without complaint, without drawing attention, and without speaking unless spoken to. It was intentional. Nora Calloway had come to Kettler to disappear, and for 22 months, she had succeeded. She was 34 years old, with dark blonde hair that she kept pulled back in a braid, so tight it gave her a slight headache by the end of every shift, a headache she preferred to the alternative, which was being seen as anything other than ordinary. She wore her scrubs in the standard hospital navy. She ate lunch alone in the break room at off-peak hours. She drove a 12-year-old pickup truck with a cracked dashboard and a radio that only picked up AM stations, and she lived in a 2-room apartment on the edge of town where the rent was low and the neighbors minded their business. Her left knee ached on cold mornings and after long shifts, which was most mornings and most shifts. She had a small collection of anti-inflammatory medications arranged on her bathroom shelf with the same precision she applied to the supply alcove. She did her stretches in the dark before her alarm went off. She did not discuss the knee. She did not discuss the scar on her forearm, or the one along her jaw that her hair mostly covered, or the reason she sometimes stopped completely still in the middle of a task and breathed through her nose 3 times before continuing. She was, to every person at Cascade Valley Medical Center, simply the quiet float nurse who stayed out of the way. Charge nurse Marlene Sutter had made her position on Nora abundantly clear during Nora's first week. Marlene was a broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s who had run the trauma unit for 11 years and operated on a system of established hierarchies that she enforced without apology. Float nurses were labor. Labor was allocated. Nora had walked in on her first shift, introduced herself, offered her background briefly, and Marlene had looked at her the way someone looks at a piece of furniture being delivered to the wrong room. Float nurses don't make clinical decisions, Marlene said, without preamble or introduction. Follow the care plan. You complete your tasks. You bring concerns to the attending or to me. Clear? Clear, Nora had said. She had not mentioned the 6 years of Army service. She had not mentioned the deployments, or the combat medical element she had led in 2 of them, or the call sign she had carried, commendation she had received for a field evacuation that her commanding officer had described in the citation as performed under conditions that should have made it impossible. She had not mentioned any of it, because she hadn't come to Kettler to be impressive. She had come to be quiet. That had worked until the night everything stopped working. It was a Tuesday in late March, and the trauma bay was operating at medium intensity, busy enough to be stressful, not so chaotic that anyone was screaming. Nora was on her second pass through the supply alcove, verifying the chest tube inventory, when she heard the monitor alarm from room 3 spike and shift into the specific pattern that meant something had changed and not in a good direction. She looked up through the alcove's narrow sightline. Room 3 held a 47-year-old man named Gordy Tate, who had come in 2 hours earlier with chest pain and shortness of breath. The attending, Dr. Philip Marsh, had assessed him, ordered an EKG and chest X-ray, and concluded with moderate confidence that they were dealing with costochondritis inflammation of the cartilage connecting the ribs. He had prescribed anti-inflammatories and was planning to discharge Gordy once his pain was managed. Nora had walked past room 3 4 times in the last hour. She was not Gordy's nurse and had no clinical authority over his care. She was aware of this clearly. She was also aware that the 4th time she walked past, she noticed that Gordy's neck veins looked different, distended in a way that didn't fit costochondritis. Color had shifted slightly. His breathing had a quality to it that she recognized from situations she was not supposed to be thinking about. She had kept walking. It wasn't her call, but the monitor alarm changed the calculation. She came out of the alcove and looked down the hall. The nurse assigned to room 3, a second-year named Priya Desai, was at the medication station, preparing Gordy's discharge paperwork. She heard the alarm and moved toward the room, unhurried, expecting the usual loose lead, a patient who had shifted position. Nora stood still for 3 seconds. Then she followed. She did not make it dramatic. She walked into room 3 behind Priya with the same flat affect she used for everything, carrying a set of extra IV supplies as cover, and she stood in the corner and looked at Gordy Tate. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 89. His blood pressure was elevated on one side. His trachea, she tracked it carefully, was deviated. Subtle, but there. His sats are dropping, Priya said, frowning at the monitor. Could be lead placement. She reached for the pulse ox to reposition it. Nora set down her supplies. It's not the lead, she said. Priya looked at her. I'm sorry? His trachea is deviated. Look at his neck veins. Nora kept her voice completely even. His breath sounds are going to be diminished on the left. I think he's developing a tension pneumothorax. Priya stared at her for a moment with an expression that mixed confusion with a faint layer of irritation. You're the float nurse. Yes. This patient is being discharged. I know. But if I'm right, he has maybe 4 minutes before his heart can't compensate. Pause that lasted too long. Nora counted it internally. Then Priya reached for her stethoscope, placed it on Gordy's chest, moved it twice, and her face changed. I'm getting Dr. Marsh, she said, and she moved fast. Nora stayed in the room. She checked Gordy's BP again. She watched his color. She spoke to him quietly. Stay with me, Mr. Tate. We're getting the doctor in the same flat, calm tone that she had once used in conditions where calm was the only thing standing between a man and his own panic, eating him alive. Dr. Marsh arrived in under 2 minutes, took 30 seconds to assess, and ordered the needle decompression immediately. Procedure was performed. Gordy's oxygen climbed back toward normal. His color returned. Marlene Sutter appeared in the doorway, approximately 4 minutes after that, having been summoned by some invisible current of institutional tension that charge nurses seem to navigate by instinct. Her eyes found Nora standing in the corner. Why is the float nurse in this room? Priya started. I heard diminished breath sounds and brought it to Priya's attention, Nora said. She made the call. This was partially true. It was true enough. Marlene looked at her for a long moment with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously: suspicion, displeasure, and a warning that was not quite articulated but was completely understood. Float nurses observe, Marlene said. They don't diagnose. I didn't diagnose anything, Nora said. I mentioned what I heard. Marlene held the look for another second, then turned back to the room. Priya, document this properly. I want the timeline clear. She left without another word. Nora returned to the supply alcove. She finished checking the chest tube inventory. She noted 2 incomplete kits and replaced the missing components. She started on the wound care dressings. She did not think about the look on Gordy Tate's face when his oxygen came back up, the way his hand had gripped the bed rail and then slowly released. She did not think about the fact that, Without the intervention, the discharge would have proceeded, and Gordy Tate would have collapsed in the hospital parking lot, probably before he reached his car. She stocked shelves. She stayed out of the way. That was the plan. Plan lasted 43 more minutes. The sound reached the trauma bay before anything visible did a deep, rhythmic thudding that initially registered as mechanical, something wrong with the hospital's HVAC system, before it resolved into something unmistakably and urgently military. 3 Black Hawks stacked in a loose formation, dropping fast toward the hospital's emergency landing pad with the kind of coordinated aggression that indicated they were not making a polite arrival. Nora heard it from the alcove and went still. Her hands stopped moving. She knew that sound the way she knew. The sound of her own heartbeat, had known it for 6 years, had calibrated everything around it, had learned to hear the difference between a standard medevac approach and something moving with operational urgency. These were moving with operational urgency. She stood in the alcove doorway and watched the trauma bay reconfigure itself around the incoming situation. Marlene Sutter appeared from her office. Dr. Marsh came in from the hallway. 2 trauma nurses on shift squared toward the entry doors, ready for whatever was coming through. The doors hit the walls with a sound like a gunshot. 6 soldiers entered in tight formation, 2 on the doors, 2 on the flanks of the stretcher, 1 at the head, 1 running alongside with IV lines held clear of the floor. Full combat gear, rifles slung, faces carrying the particular compressed expression of people who had been doing something extremely difficult and were not finished yet. On the stretcher, a man in military clothing, his right leg ending in a field amputation below the knee, a stump dressed in layers of combat gauze, and a tourniquet that had clearly been tightened and reset multiple times. His oxygen saturation monitor showed 81%. His lips were slightly blue. His chest was moving wrong too fast, asymmetrical, the left side lagging. Nora saw all of this in the first 3 seconds from the alcove doorway. The commander, tall, dust-coated, moving with the particular authority of someone who expected to be obeyed before he spoke, swept the trauma bay with one hard look. His eyes went across Marlene, across Dr. Marsh, across the trauma nurses, and found nothing that satisfied whatever he was searching for. "Where is Beacon?" he said. The trauma bay went quiet in a way that it almost never went quiet. Marlene stepped forward. "This is Cascade Valley Medical Center. I'm Charge Nurse Sutter. I need you to identify your patient and your unit and—" "Beacon," the commander said again. Not louder, but with a precision that made the repetition feel entirely different from the first. "Army combat medic. 6 years of service. Last deployment 10th Mountain. She works in this hospital. I need her now." Marlene's expression shifted through several registers. "I don't know who you're talking about. We have a patient who needs—" Nora stepped out of the supply alcove. She had not made a decision to do this in any way she could articulate. She had simply moved, the way she had always moved when something needed doing, and she was the person who knew how to do it. Her feet carried her forward before her thoughts had fully caught up, and by the time she registered what she was doing, she was already 4 steps into the open floor of the trauma bay. Commander's eyes found her immediately. They were dark, steady, and entirely certain. "Your Beacon," he said. It wasn't a question. Nora looked at him for 1 second. Then she looked at the man on the stretcher. She read his chest movement again, his color, the way his mouth was working slightly around each breath. "Got a tension pneumo developing on the left," she said. "I need a 14-gauge needle, 60mm minimum, and I need it now. And someone get me a chest tube kit." She moved toward the stretcher. Marlene Sutter stepped directly into her path. "You are a float nurse." Marlene's voice had dropped to something quiet and hard. "You do not give orders in this trauma bay." Nora looked at the monitor. "Oxygen saturation, 78%, and dropping." "Then watch him die while we sort out the paperwork," she said. Came out flat, without heat, which was somehow worse than if she had been angry. She wasn't performing anything. She was simply stating the arithmetic. Dr. Marsh, who had been standing 2 feet to Marlene's left, looked at the monitor, looked at the patient, and made a decision. "Get the kit," he said to Priya. Marlene turned toward him sharply. "Philip, get the kit," he said again. Priya moved. Nora was already at the stretcher. She placed both hands on the patient's chest, in the trained sequence, assessing without moving him unnecessarily, getting her bearings by touch and visual, and she found what she expected to find. "His trachea's midline right now, but it's going to shift," she said. To nobody in particular. To the room. To whoever was listening. He's building pressure in the left chest. The tourniquet's good, the amputation site is stable, but if we don't decompress this lung, he's going to arrest. One of the soldiers at the stretcher, younger, with a bandage on his own forearm that he was ignoring completely, said, "His SATs were fine until 20 minutes out, then just dropped. Flying at altitude," Nora said. "Pressure differential accelerates it." She looked at him. "You did the right thing getting him here fast." The kit arrived. Nora opened it with the efficiency of muscle memory, no hesitation, no fumbling, no checking the packaging twice, and located the landmarks on the patient's chest by touch. Marlene's voice came from behind her. "You do not have authorization to perform this procedure. You are a float nurse. If you touch that patient with a needle, I will have you suspended before you leave this room." Nora did not stop moving. "Major," Marlene turned toward the commander. "This woman is not authorized." "Her name is Specialist Nora Calloway," the commander said, and his voice had gone very still. "She's a decorated Army combat medic with 6 years of service, 2 combat deployments, and more field surgical experience than half your attending staff. If she says your patient needs a needle, your patient needs a needle." Marlene's mouth opened. The commander looked at her with an expression that was not unkind and was completely immovable. "Stand back." Nora inserted the needle. The rush of air was immediate, audible, definitive, the sound of pressure releasing from a space that had been building toward catastrophe. Patient's oxygen saturation dropped to 74 for 10 seconds, then began climbing. 77, 81, 85. The room exhaled. Nora kept her attention on the patient. "He's going to need the chest tube placed before surgery. The needle bought time. It's not a fix." She looked at Dr. Marsh. "He needs a thoracic surgeon in the next 30 minutes. "I'll make the call," Marsh said. "His amputation site, the tourniquet's been on for a while. You'll want vascular to assess for reperfusion injury." "Got it. He's got bruising here." She indicated the patient's left flank, pressing carefully. "That pattern suggests possible splenic involvement. He may be bleeding internally. Get imaging, but don't wait for it to make decisions." Marsh was writing. He was keeping up. He was, Nora noticed, looking at her with an expression she did not have time to parse. Step back from the stretcher. Marlene Sutter had not moved from the position she'd taken 3 feet away. Her face had gone through several transitions and settled on something that was not quite fury and not quite fear, but contained elements of both. "You are suspended," she said. Nora looked at her. "You violated hospital policy. You performed a procedure without authorization. You will leave this floor immediately." The oxygen saturation monitor now read 91% and climbing. Commander stepped forward. "That's Major." Marlene's voice was sharp. "This is a civilian medical facility. Your presence here is at our discretion, and whatever authority you carry in the field does not extend to my trauma unit. This nurse violated protocol, and she will face the consequences of that." She looked at Nora. "Leave the floor. Now." One of Marlene's staff nurses was already moving toward Nora with the particular body language of someone who had been given an unpleasant assignment. Nora looked once more at the patient on the stretcher. Color was better. His chest was moving with something closer to symmetry. He was not going to arrest. She picked up the gloves she'd set on the edge of the cart and peeled them off. She walked toward the exit without another word. The commander's voice came from behind her, quiet, directed specifically at the back of her head. "Specialist Calloway," she stopped. "Don't go far," he said. She did not turn around. She pushed through the trauma bay doors and walked into the hallway beyond, where the fluorescent lights hummed their usual indifferent hum, and the linoleum reflected her own image back at her in a long, distorted strip. Her knee ached. Her hands were steady. She had taken 34 steps down the hallway toward the administration wing when the door behind her opened again, and the sound of boots, one set, purposeful, faster than hospital pace, came after her. Already knew who it was. She stopped walking before he spoke. "I thought you were gone," the commander said. Nora turned. He was closer than she expected, his jacket still carrying the dust of wherever they'd come from, his eyes doing the same thing they'd been doing since he walked into the trauma bay, finding her, settling certain. "I was gone," she said. "Your name wasn't hard to find once we knew where to look." He stopped a few feet away. "Your discharge papers listed Kettler as your intended address. We've been working through the leads for 6 weeks." 6 weeks, she repeated. Graves needed someone specific. He said the patient's name without ceremony. The way you say the name of someone who is still alive, and you intend to keep it that way. He asked for you. Something moved through Nora's chest, and she controlled it before it reached her face. Graves is on that table, she said. He is. You just bought him enough time to survive the table. The commander paused. My name is Major Daniel Wick. I ran the unit that Graves was attached to. Nora knew who Daniel Wick was. She had not expected him to be the one who came looking. Why are you telling me this in a hospital hallway? She said. Because in about 10 minutes, hospital administration is going to come through those doors to process your suspension, and I want you to understand what's happening before that does. He looked at her steadily. We pulled your service record this morning, Calloway. Full record. Not the summary. The complete file. Nora said nothing. Your charge nurse has been employed at this hospital for 11 years, Wick said. She has full access to personnel files, including the intake credentials section, where returning veterans are asked to list prior medical training. He let that sit. We're going to need to talk about what she did with yours. Nora went still. Her knee throbbed. Her knee throbbed. Down the hall, the doors to the administration swung open, and 3 people in business clothing came out, carrying the particular energy of a problem that needed to be managed before it became a liability. Behind them, from the direction of the trauma bay, Marlene Sutter appeared in the corridor, with her arms crossed, and her mouth set in a line that said she intended to control what happened next. Nora looked at her. For 2 years, she had kept her head down, stocked the shelves, stayed out of the way. For 2 years, she had let Marlene Sutter treat her like a pair of hands attached to an empty chest. She had done this by choice, because she had decided that the life she carried before this one was something she could leave at the edge of the city limits. But Graves was behind those doors, and he had asked for her by name, and someone had made sure the trail to her was hard to find. Marlene's eyes met hers across the length of the corridor. In that look, something shifted. Marlene knew what Wick had just said. Nora could see it not in guilt, not yet, but in the slight recalculation happening behind the charge nurse's eyes, the recognition that the walls she had built were about to be examined by people with authority she had not anticipated. Major Wick stepped to Nora's side. Not in front of her, not shielding her, but alongside the way. A soldier stands next to someone they consider a peer. You're not going to administration, he said quietly. They'll suspend me anyway, Nora said. Let them try. He said it without bravado. Just fact. One of the administrators, a man in a gray suit, with the look of someone who had been calculating liability since the helicopters landed, reached them first. Ms. Calloway, I'm going to need you to come with me for a formal review of... This conversation is going to wait, Wick said. The administrator blinked. Major, I understand your unit has a patient in our care, but hospital policy. Your hospital's policy, Wick said, in the same quiet voice that he'd used in the trauma bay, will be reviewed along with everything else. Right now, I have a soldier in your trauma bay who is alive because this woman made a decision that your charge nurse tried to prevent. I have questions about why that decision was necessary, and I intend to get answers before anyone in this building goes anywhere. Corridor went quiet. Marlene Sutter, 30 feet away, did not move. Nora looked at the administrator, then at Wick, then at the length of the corridor that connected where she was standing, to where Graves was fighting to stay alive behind closed doors. 2 years of stocking shelves, 2 years of gloves in the alcove, and lunch alone in the break room, and yes, ma'am, and out of the way. She wasn't trembling. Her hands were the same hands that had done what needed doing, twice tonight, and they were steady. Something underneath the steadiness, something she had kept very carefully below the surface, since the day she drove into Kettler with a cracked dashboard and a plan to disappear, had shifted. It hadn't broken open. It hadn't become anything loud. It had simply stopped agreeing to stay buried. The administrator in the gray suit looked between Nora and Major Wick, with the expression of a man who had prepared for one kind of conversation and found himself standing in the middle of an entirely different one. His name badge read, Terrence, Hollis Director of Risk Management, and he had arrived in the corridor with a clipboard and the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making problems disappear before they reached the board level. He had not anticipated the military component. That much was visible in the slight adjustment of his posture, the recalibration happening behind his eyes. Major Wick, Hollis said carefully, I understand the urgency of your soldier's situation, and I want to be clear that Cascade Valley is fully committed to his care. But what happened in that trauma bay is a separate matter, and it needs to be addressed through our internal process. Your internal process, Wick said, can run parallel to mine. I'm not stopping anything. I'm telling you that Ms. Calloway stays in this corridor until I've finished a conversation with her, and anyone who wants to change that can take it up with the post commander at Fort Callum. He said this the same way he said everything. Without emphasis, without performance, like it was simply the arrangement of facts in their correct order. Hollis wrote something on his clipboard that was probably not what he was actually thinking. Marlene Sutter, who had moved 12 feet closer during this exchange, without appearing to move at all, said, "The issue isn't the patient's outcome, Major. Issue is the protocol violation. If we allow float nurses to perform emergency procedures on their own initiative, we expose the hospital to Wick said. Marlene stopped. "What exactly?" he said again, still quiet. She did not answer. The question had landed in a place she hadn't prepared for. Nora stood slightly apart from all of them, her arms at her sides, watching this exchange with the detached focus she applied to situations where her job was to read what was happening rather than direct it. She was tracking Marlene, specifically the way the charge nurse held her ground, the way her certainty had a quality to it that was not quite what it appeared, the way she had arrived in the corridor before the administrators and positioned herself in a way that looked defensive rather than supervisory. She was already managing something, Nora realized, had been managing it since the helicopters landed. This was not a charge nurse enforcing policy. This was someone controlling information. Nora filed that observation and said nothing. Hollis cleared his throat. "Perhaps we can step into a conference room and I need 5 minutes with Ms. Calloway," Wick said. "Then she's yours." Hollis looked at Marlene, who gave a small nod that communicated more than it should have too much coordination between a risk management director and a charge nurse, too much agreement for two people who were supposed to be operating in separate lanes. Step back. Not far. Far enough. Wick turned to Nora and lowered his voice to something that didn't carry. "Graves has been running a classified recovery operation for the last 4 months. The details aren't mine to share with you fully, but the short version is that what happened to him tonight was the result of an extraction that went wrong. He's been in theater, Calloway, not a training exercise." Nora absorbed this without expression. When he went down, the first thing he said when he was conscious enough to say anything was your name. Not a facility, not a protocol, your name. Wick watched her carefully. "I need you to understand that before the next hour happens, because the next hour is going to require you to make some decisions about how visible you're willing to be. I've been making that decision for 2 years, Norris said. You made it for yourself. Now it involves him." He paused. "And it involves what we found this afternoon when we were trying to track you down." Her eyes sharpened slightly. "What did you find?" Wick reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document, a printout, she could see, of something that had been pulled from a database. He held it out without explanation. She took it, unfolded it. It was a personnel intake form. Her personnel intake form from when she had applied to Cascade Valley Medical Center 22 months ago. The section midway down the page asked returning military personnel to list prior medical certifications, clinical training, and service-related experience. The instructions noted that this information would be forwarded to the credentialing committee for review. The section was blank, not unfilled, not skipped. Blank in the way that a form is blank when its contents have been removed, the surrounding fields complete, the handwriting around it present, the specific section gone as if it had never been touched. Nora looked at it for a long moment. She had filled that section in. She remembered doing it. She had written carefully, listing her certifications, her years of service, the field surgical training, the combat medic qualification, the emergency procedures she was credentialed to perform. She had handed the completed form to the intake coordinator on her first day, the same way she had handed over her identification and her nursing license. Someone had taken that information out. "When did you pull this?" she said. "This afternoon. 6 weeks of chasing your address got us to your employer, and when we requested your file to verify your credentials before we made contact, this is what we found." Wick looked at her steadily. "Your military training doesn't appear anywhere in your personnel record, Calloway. Not in the credentialing file, not in the skills inventory, nowhere. As far as this hospital's records are concerned, you are a registered nurse with a standard clinical background and no specialty training." Nora folded the form. The corridor felt slightly different than it had 30 seconds ago. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the same. The linoleum was the same. Her knee was the same. But something had realigned a piece of the last 22 months, clicking into a position she hadn't known to look for. It explained things. It explained why she had been classified as a float nurse when her nursing license alone should have qualified her for at least a permanent med-surg position. It explained why her competency evaluations, which she knew she had passed without difficulty, had never resulted in an advancement offer. It explained why Marlene Sutter had looked at her on day one with that particular certainty. Not the certainty of someone making an initial assessment, but someone already aware of what she had decided. She knew, Nora said. It wasn't a question. The intake coordinator who processed your paperwork on day one reported to the charge nurse, Wick said. That was the standard process here at the time. The charge nurse reviewed credentials before they went to the committee. Nora looked down the corridor. Marlene was 20 feet away, in conversation with Hollis, her back partially turned. She had her arms crossed in that way she always did, self-possessed, unassailable, the body language of a woman who had run a unit for 11 years and had never once been successfully questioned. Nora had spent 2 years staying out of that woman's way, and it turned out the reason she'd needed to stay out of her way was partly because Marlene had made sure she had nowhere else to go. She handed the form back to Wick. Keep it, he said. Put it in her scrubs pocket. What happens now? She said. Right now, Graves is in surgery prep. The thoracic team is working on his chest, and vascular is assessing the amputation site. Wick glanced toward the trauma bay doors. Going to survive the next hour. After that depends on what the surgical team finds. He looked back at her. What happens with you depends on what you decide. You said there were decisions. There are. You can go with Hollis right now. Let them suspend you and wait for the process to run. Take weeks. In the meantime, Graves is in this hospital and his team is here, and I need someone he trusts in his recovery environment. He kept his voice level. Or you can stay. And the conversation about your credentials happens now instead of later, and it happens with the full file on the table. Nora's knee throbbed once, sharply, and she shifted her weight without thinking about it. If I stay, she said, Marlene is going to have a difficult few hours regardless, Wick said. That's already in motion. The question is whether you're present for it, or whether you're sitting in a suspension review, waiting for a process that was built by people who don't know what they're actually reviewing. Hollis appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision, beginning to move toward them again, with the tentative momentum of a man who had given them longer than he intended. Nora breathed through her nose. Once. Twice. She thought about Graves on the table behind those doors. She thought about the personnel form in her pocket with its deliberate blank space. She thought about 22 months of supply carts and lunch breaks at off-peak hours, and a life that had been smaller than it needed to be, not because she had chosen to make it small, because someone had quietly removed the evidence that it could be anything else. She thought about the soldier from room 3, earlier tonight, Gordy Tate, whose name she didn't even know until she read it on the door, and the way Marlene had looked at her afterward. Not with recognition, but with management. She looked at Wick. Full file on the table, she said. Wick nodded once. What followed did not look like justice from the outside. From the outside, it looked like a meeting. Hollis led them into a conference room. On the administrative floor round table, 6 chairs, a whiteboard with something from a previous meeting, still visible in blue marker, a window that looked out over the parking structure. Hollis sat at the head. Wick sat across from him. Nora sat to the side, which was where she always ended up in rooms, and which she had learned meant you could see everyone without being the obvious center, which had operational value. Marlene arrived 3 minutes later. She had brought someone with her, a woman named Gail Purcell from Human Resources, who carried a laptop and the demeanor of a person accustomed to making difficult conversations procedurally navigable. Gail set up her laptop with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times and believed the procedure would hold. I want to start by clarifying the scope of tonight's incident, Hollis said. Clinical procedure was performed by a staff member without attending authorizations. The attending authorized it, Wick said. Dr. Marsh gave verbal authorization for the chest tube kit to be retrieved. Miss Calloway performed the needle decompression while that kit was in transit, which is consistent with emergency field protocols when patient status is deteriorating rapidly. Hollis looked at Gail, who was typing. Marlene said, Philip Marsh is not her supervising physician. Float nurses have a clearly defined scope of practice here, and performing invasive procedures falls outside. Does it? Wick reached into his jacket. He produced a second document, this one a copy of a certification record. He slid it across the table. Specialist Nora Calloway holds an Army Combat Medic certification, a Tactical Combat Casualty Care qualification, and a Field Surgical Assist certification. She has performed needle thoracentesis, chest tube insertion, surgical airway management, and emergency hemorrhage control procedures in active combat conditions. He slid another sheet. This is her service record. This is her commendation from her second deployment. This is the after-action report from an extraction in which she performed 4 simultaneous emergency procedures under direct fire and kept 3 soldiers alive until evacuation. The table was quiet. These credentials, Wick continued, are not present anywhere in Cascade Valley Medical Center's personnel file for Ms. Calloway. I have a copy of her intake form, which shows the credentialing section was submitted blank, despite the fact that Ms. Calloway has testified, and I have reason to believe, that she completed that section fully on her intake day. He looked at Marlene. I'd like to understand how that happens. Marlene's expression did not collapse. It was not that kind of moment. People who have controlled environments for 11 years do not collapse at conference tables. But something in her face shifted in a way that Nora recognized the recalibration of someone who had believed they were managing a problem and was now understanding that the problem had a different size than they'd estimated. Personnel forms go through the intake coordinator, Marlene said. I don't process individual sections. The intake coordinator at the time of Ms. Calloway's hire was a woman named Sandra Rice, who reported to you directly, Wick said. Ms. Rice is no longer employed at Cascade Valley. She left 8 months ago. He paused. We spoke with her this afternoon. Gail Purcell's typing slowed. Hollis put down his pen. Marlene said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to mean something. I'm going to recommend, Wick said, in the same steady register he'd used all night, that this hospital's credentialing committee convene an emergency review of Ms. Calloway's qualifications using the complete military file I've provided. I'm also going to recommend that the matter of the intake form be referred to an independent investigator rather than handled internally. He looked at Hollis. Those recommendations come from me personally. I'll be following up through official channels in the morning. Hollis said, Major, I want to be clear that this hospital takes any credentialing irregularity very seriously. I know you do, Wick said. I'm counting on it. Nora was watching Marlene. The charge nurse was looking at the documents on the table with the expression of someone reading a map and finding that the roads they relied on had been quietly rerouted. There was no guilt visible. Marlene was not built for visible guilt, but there was a recalculation happening that was almost physical, a reassessment of what she thought she had controlled and what had turned out to be outside that control. She looked up and met Nora's eyes. It was the first time Marlene had looked at her, actually looked at her, rather than through her or past her in 22 months. The look contained something complicated that Nora did not try to name. It did less than 2 seconds. Then Marlene looked away. The meeting continued for 30 more minutes. Hollis asked questions. Gail typed. Wick answered precisely and offered nothing beyond what was asked. Nora spoke only when directly addressed, and when she did, she kept it factual and short. The suspension was not formally rescinded during the meeting. Hollis said it would be reviewed, but the energy around it had changed in a way that made the formal status feel increasingly academic. At the end, Hollis said he would convene the credentialing committee as soon as possible and conduct a review of the intake process for returning military personnel generally. Wick said that was acceptable. Marlene left without speaking. Nora noticed that Gail Purcell, as she packed up her laptop, glanced at Nora with the very brief expression of someone who had reached a private conclusion and had no venue to express it. In the corridor outside the conference room, Wick stopped walking. That's not over, he said. I know, Nora said. She's going to try to manage the narrative. She has 11 years of institutional capital in that building, and you have 22 months of keeping your head down. I know, she said again. He looked at her for a moment. You're not worried. I'm very worried, she said. I'm just not showing it right now because it wouldn't help. Something in Wick's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, the recognition one person gives another when they understand the operational logic of a position. Fair enough, he said. He told her he was going back to the surgical floor to wait for news on Graves. He told her to stay in the building and stay accessible. He did not tell her what to do about her suspension, which, she interpreted as tacit acknowledgement that she would make that call herself. Stood in the corridor for a moment after he walked away. Then she turned and went back toward the trauma unit. Not inside, the doors were closed, and the shift was running, and she was still technically suspended, but to the small waiting alcove near the unit entrance, where the chairs were hard and the coffee machine dispensed. Something that could generously be described as warm. She sat down. She pulled the intake form from her pocket and looked at it again. The blank section. Her name at the top. The date? 22 months ago, 6 days after she had driven into Kettler, with a cracked dashboard and a plan. She thought about what she had written in that section carefully, in the clear print she had always used for anything medical. The sequence of certifications, the surgical assist qualifications, the years of service. She had written it all down because the form asked for it, because lying on a hospital intake form was a thing she was incapable of doing, because even when she wanted to disappear, she was constitutionally unable to misrepresent her training. And someone had taken it out, and she had spent 22 months stocking shelves. She folded the form back along its crease and put it in her pocket. From down the hall came the sound of a gurney moving, the specific wheel squeak rhythm of OR transport, someone going into or coming out of surgery. She tracked it by sound without looking up. Single gurney, moving at a controlled pace, which meant stable, which meant whoever was on it was not in immediate danger. She sat with that for a while. The waiting alcove was empty except for her. Coffee machine hummed. The overhead fluorescent closest to her was cycling toward the end of its useful life, flickering at irregular intervals that she had unconsciously begun to track. She had good pattern recognition. She couldn't turn it off even when there was nothing productive to apply it to. 40 minutes passed. She knew this because she checked her watch at the 30-minute mark and again at the 40, not because she was impatient, but because she had learned a long time ago that time needed to be tracked even when nothing seemed to be happening. Because something was always happening. You were just waiting to see where it surfaced. Surfaced in the form of Dr. Philip Marsh, who came around the corner from the direction of the surgical floor, looking like a man who had been through several consecutive difficult things and had decided to find her specifically rather than go home. He was in his late 40s, with the build of someone who had once been athletic and now carried the subtle compression of long hours and bad cafeteria food. He had a habit of pulling at his left earlobe when he was thinking, which she had observed multiple times without ever mentioning it. He was doing it now. He sat down in the chair across from her without asking if she wanted company. "Graves is out of the thoracic procedure," he said. "They got the chest tube placed, and the pressure is resolved. Vascular is still working on the amputation site. Splenic," she said. "Grade 2 laceration. They're managing it conservatively. No surgery yet." "You called it." "Lucky guess," she said. He looked at her with an expression that communicated he did not find this amusing. "It wasn't, and we both know that." She said nothing. Hold his earlobe. "I want to ask you something directly, and I'd like you to answer me directly." "All right. Why didn't you tell anyone? When you started here, why didn't you list your training?" "I did," she said. "It wasn't in the file when the Army pulled it today." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that," he said. "I know. Marlene." He stopped. "You don't have to say it." He pulled his earlobe again. "I should have looked more carefully. Staff I was working with. At who was on the floor. I should have." He stopped again. "You had a trauma unit to run," she said. "You operated within the system you had. That's a generous reading. It's an accurate one." She looked at him. "You authorized the kit. Tonight, when it mattered, you authorized the kit." He sat with this for a moment. He didn't deflect it or argue with it. He just sat with it, which she thought was probably the most honest thing he could do. "Credentialing committee is meeting tomorrow morning," he said. "Hollis called an emergency session. I've been asked to submit a clinical account of what I observed tonight." He looked at her steadily. "I'm going to tell them exactly what I saw." "I know," she said. "All of it, including the part where I hesitated." She looked at him. "You stepped forward before I made the call," he said. "That's in the record. I'm not going to make it sound like I was ahead of you when I wasn't." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, stood up. "Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's going to be." He didn't finish the sentence, which she appreciated. Finishing it would have required a kind of certainty about tomorrow that neither of them actually had. He left. She sat alone in the alcove. The fluorescent light flickered at its irregular interval. Coffee machine finished whatever cycle it ran through at this hour, and went silent. Nora thought about Graves on the surgical table. She thought about the intake form in her pocket. She thought about Marlene Sutter, somewhere in this building or already outside it, constructing whatever version of tonight she intended to present to the credentialing committee, to Hollis, to whoever would listen. She thought about Sandra Rice, whose name she had not known until tonight, who had been the intake coordinator and who had left 8 months ago, and whom Major Wick had spoken with that afternoon. She wondered what Sandra Rice had said. She wondered how long Sandra Rice had been carrying it. She leaned her head back against the wall. Her knee pulsed. She did her stretches without getting up, the ones she could do seated, the small movements that kept the scar tissue from locking. She had done them so many times they were automatic. She was still doing them when the sound came from the direction of the nurse's station. It was a small sound, a door opening faster than it should have. Footsteps at a pace that wasn't quite running, but was moving with the particular compression of urgency that hospital staff learned to modulate when they didn't want to alarm patients, but needed to be somewhere immediately. Then a voice breathed a sigh, recognizable by pitch, saying something sharp and short that Nora couldn't quite make out through the alcove wall. Then the overhead announcement, in the careful clinical language that hospitals used to avoid saying the thing directly, a rapid response call. The surgical floor, Recovery Suite 4. Nora was on her feet before the announcement finished. Recovery Suite 4 was where they took post-surgical patients from thoracic procedures. She was moving down the corridor before she had consciously decided to move, her knee complaining at the pace she was setting, and her ignoring it, already cataloging the possibilities, the scenarios, the interventions, everything she knew about post-thoracic complications and what the first 30 seconds looked like when something went wrong. She hit the stairwell door and took the stairs 2 at a time. She pushed through the surgical floor door. Ahead of her, through the window of Recovery Suite 4, she could see the cluster of staff around a bed, the rapid response team converging from the left corridor, a monitor displaying numbers she couldn't read from this distance. Standing in the hallway outside the suite, not inside where the action was, but pressed against the opposite wall, with her arms crossed and her face arranged into something carefully neutral, was Marlene Sutter. Marlene had beaten her up here. Marlene was watching Recovery Suite 4, with the expression of someone who was waiting for an outcome, and Nora, who had spent 22 months reading the environment of this hospital the way she had once read the terrain of places that wanted to kill her, understood with a cold, clean certainty that this was not a charge nurse following up on a patient of interest. Marlene turned her head. She saw Nora. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Marlene's eyes went back to the suite window, deliberately the way someone looks away when they've decided you don't factor into their calculations anymore. Inside the suite, the rapid response team was working on Graves. Part 3, Nora did not look at Marlene again. She pushed through the door of Recovery 4, and the rapid response team parted for her, the way people part for someone moving with absolute directional certainty, not because they recognized her authority, but because the alternative was being walked through. The suite was small and suddenly crowded 2 nurses, the rapid response physician, a respiratory tech with a bag valve mask, all of them working in the compressed choreography of a deteriorating patient. Graves was on the bed. His color had gone wrong, not the blue of hypoxia, but the gray-white of hemodynamic instability, which was a different problem and in some ways a worse one. The monitor showed a heart rate of 142, blood pressure 68/40, oxygen saturation holding at 94 on supplemental oxygen. He was conscious, which was both good and terrible good, because his airway was maintaining, terrible, because he was aware enough to be afraid, and she could see it in the way his hand was gripping the bed rail with the only arm he could reliably use. The rapid response physician, a compact woman named Dr. Anita Ferris, who Nora recognized from 2 previous overnight codes, was directing the team with quick, precise instructions. She had ordered a fluid bolus and was reassessing the abdomen, pressing carefully at the left upper quadrant, with a focus that told Nora she had already reached the same conclusion Nora was reaching. "The splenic lac is bleeding," Nora said. Ferris looked up. "Who are you?" "Float nurse. I assessed him on intake." She moved to the left side of the bed. His pressure was holding conservatively, but his rate's climbing and his pressure's dropping. "That's not post-thoracic. He's filling." Ferris looked at the monitor, then at Nora. "What's his intake fluid status?" 2 liters on transport, 1 more in the trauma bay. His last recorded pressure before the thoracic procedure was 92/60. He's lost at least 20 points since then, and his rate's compensating. She looked at the abdomen. He needs a fast exam now, and if it's positive, he needs the OR. We have a fast machine in the corner, Ferris said. She looked at one of the nurses. Get it. Nobody questioned this. The machine was retrieved. Ferris ran the probe herself, moving through the abdominal views with practiced efficiency, and when she hit the left upper quadrant, the answer was immediate and unambiguous fluid in the parasplenic space. More than a conservative grade 2 should be producing at this stage. He's bleeding, Ferris said. Yes, Nora said. Ferris was already on the phone to the OR. Her voice was controlled and fast. Graves' hand was still on the rail, and Nora put her hand over his. Not gently, not in the way a person comforts someone, but in the way you establish contact with someone who is frightened and needs an anchor that isn't their own failing body. Hey, she said. His eyes found hers. The chest is stable, she said. This is a different problem. We caught it. You're going to the OR. He said something she couldn't quite hear. She leaned in. Didn't think his voice was thin, working against the effort of maintaining blood pressure. Didn't think you'd still be here. I'm still here, she said. Wick found you, he said. Wick found me. Something moved through his expression, not relief exactly, but the particular relaxation of someone who has been carrying a contingency plan and just been told it was no longer necessary. Closed his eyes. The OR team arrived in under 4 minutes. Nora stepped back to give them space and watched Graves' bed move through the suite door with the coordinated urgency of a team that had been told the patient was losing ground. She tracked him with her eyes until the door swung closed. And then she stood in the recovering quiet of the emptied suite and let the adrenaline do what adrenaline did. When you finally stop moving, settle into the bones like cold water, leaving everything slightly heavy. Ferris was at the documentation station, entering the emergency response notes. Paused and looked at Nora. You're suspended, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was information, delivered with the neutral precision of a physician organizing facts. Yes, Nora said. But you came anyway. Yes. Ferris looked at her for a moment longer. Going to want a debrief from you when this is over. About the initial presentation, the intake assessment, all of it. Can you be available? I'll be in the building, Nora said. She left the suite. In the hallway, Marlene Sutter was gone. The hallway was empty except for the ambient sounds of a hospital, at this hour the distant roll of a medication cart, the muffled voice of an overhead page 2 floors up, the particular silence of a floor that had just sent a patient to emergency surgery and was waiting to find out what that meant. Nora stood in it for a moment, long enough to breathe through her nose twice and register the pain in her knee, which had been making its case for the last 40 minutes and was no longer being subtle about it. She thought about where Marlene had gone. The charge nurse's presence on this floor before the rapid response call was something Nora had not yet fully accounted for. Marlene's unit was the trauma bay on the floor below. Post-surgical recovery was outside her immediate jurisdiction. She had no clinical reason to be on this floor at this hour, no assigned patients, no direct supervisory responsibility over the rapid response process. But she had been here, standing outside the suite, watching, and she had seen Nora come through the door. Nora did not know exactly what that meant yet, but she knew enough to know it meant something, and she knew enough about how institutions worked, how information moved through them, how narratives got constructed before investigations could run, to understand that the next several hours would determine the shape of whatever came next. The stairs back down. The administrative floor was quiet. Conference room where they had met with Hollis was dark, its lights off. The chairs, exactly where they'd been left. She passed it without stopping and continued toward the small office at the end of the corridor where she knew, from 22 months of watching this building operate, that the overnight security officer kept a desk and usually left the door open. She was not going to security. She was going to the records annex that sat beside the security office, which contained the hospital's physical personnel files in a locked cabinet that required a supervisor key to access. She knew this because she had been sent to the annex twice in her first month to retrieve her own onboarding documents when HR had a system issue, and because she paid attention to things that other people didn't think required attention. She was also not going to the records annex. Not yet. She was still suspended, and she was still, technically, operating at the edges of what she could do in this building. Without that, becoming a problem. What she was going to do was sit in the corridor outside the annex and think. She sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, no chairs here, nothing designed for waiting, and she pulled her knee up to stretch the scar tissue, and she thought what she had, a blank intake form, a personnel record with no military credentials, charge nurse who had been on the wrong floor before a medical emergency involving the patient that same charge nurse had tried to prevent her from treating, an HR intake coordinator who had left the hospital 8 months ago and had spoken with Major Wick that afternoon. What she didn't have, Sandra Rice's account of what she had actually said to Wick, the full extent of what Marlene had or hadn't done with the intake information, any direct evidence connecting Marlene to the blank section beyond the chain of custody that Wick had laid out in the conference room, logical, but not documented. What Marlene had, 11 years. Institutional capital that Nora could not overstate. Staff that was loyal not out of affection, but out of the practical reality that Marlene controlled scheduling evaluations and the daily working conditions of everyone in that unit. A narrative she had been building since the helicopters landed, one that centered on protocol violations and a float nurse who had exceeded her scope, and that narrative had been constructed before anyone in that room knew what the intake form contained. Nora was not naive about which of them was better positioned right now. She was also not, despite the cold floor and the throbbing knee and the accumulated weight of a night that had started with a supply cart and ended on a surgical floor, afraid. She was tired. She was angry in the controlled way that useful anger operated, the kind that sharpened rather than scattered. And she was thinking very clearly. She heard footsteps. They were coming from the direction of the main corridor, measured, not hurried, with the particular heel-to-toe pressure of someone walking deliberately in a direction they had chosen rather than one they'd been sent. She tracked the sound and did not move. Major Wick came around the corner and stopped when he saw her on the floor. He looked at her for a second. Then he sat down on the floor beside her with the ease of a man who had sat on worse surfaces in worse circumstances and did not consider it remarkable. "Graves is in surgery," he said. "I know, I was there when they took him." He looked at her sideways. "You were in his suite." The rapid response call went out. "I went up." He didn't comment on the suspension. She appreciated this. "Ferris thinks he'll make it through," he said. "Chest is stable. The splenic bleed is contained in the OR. Vascular says the amputation site has good perfusion considering the tourniquet time. Going to have a long recovery," Nora said. Yeah, Wick was quiet for a moment. He knows that. He went in knowing the operation was high risk. He's not the kind of person who makes those decisions without understanding the math. She thought of Graves' hand on the bed rail. The particular kind of grip. She had held people's hands in worse positions than that, and she knew the difference between someone holding on out of fear and someone holding on out of will. Graves had been holding on out of will. "What did Sandra Rice tell you?" Nora said. Wick turned slightly. "I wasn't planning to get into the details until tomorrow. Marlene was on the surgical floor tonight before the rapid response call went out. Outside Graves' suite." Wick went still. It was a very small stillness, barely visible, the kind of response a person has when a piece of information lands in a place they were not expecting it. Processed it. She could track the processing in the slight shift of his posture. "You're certain," he said. "I saw her. She saw me." He was quiet for a moment. "Does she have any clinical reason to be on that floor?" "Her unit is the trauma bay." Another silence. Longer. "Sandra Rice," Wick said finally, "told me that on the day of your hire, she processed your intake form with your complete information filled in. She forwarded it to the charge nurse for review, which was the standard protocol at that time. She said that approximately a week later, Marlene Sutter returned the form to her and told her the military credentials section needed to be cleared because it contained information that hadn't been verified by the appropriate committee and would create a liability issue during the probationary period. He paused. She was told to refile it with that section blank and wait for the committee to request the information separately. The committee never requested it, Nora said no, because Marlene controlled what went to the committee. The charge nurse had final review authority over float nurse files at that time. The protocol was changed 8 months ago, which is roughly when Sandra Rice left. He let the timing sit in the space between them. Rice said she thought at the time it was a legitimate administrative process. She said she understood later that it wasn't, and that she left partly because she didn't want to be connected to it. Nora looked at the far wall. 22 months. It wasn't malice she was sitting with, or rather was, but it was the specific kind of malice that came wrapped in administrative logic, in plausible deniability, in the language of procedure and liability and protocol. Kind that was very difficult to confront directly, because it had never needed to declare itself. Kept me in the supply alcove, Nora said. Not bitterly, just clearly. Yes, Wick said, because she thought I was hiding for a reason. She remembered Marlene's language from the conference room, the phrase she had used, the framing of it. She decided before I walked in the door that someone with my background who wanted to be a float nurse must be running from something. She decided that was her call to make. That's what Rice believed, Wick said. Nora thought about this, about the particular logic of it, the way someone could take a genuine human assumption, a not entirely unreasonable one, and build an entire architecture of control around it without ever needing to be explicitly malicious. Marlene had not necessarily set out to destroy anything. She had set out to manage a situation she thought she understood, and in doing so had dismantled something she had no right to touch. She was on that floor, Nora said again. Wick touched his feet. He extended a hand down to her. She took it, not because she needed the help, but because declining it would have been a statement, and she was not interested in making statements right now. I'm going to make a call, he said. I have the post commander on standby. If what you're telling me about Marlene's presence on that floor is what it looks like, this moves from a credentialing issue to something the hospital's ethics board needs to be involved in. He looked at her steadily. I need you to write down exactly what you observed. Time, location, what she was doing, what she said, everything. She didn't say anything. Write down that she didn't say anything. Every detail. Nora nodded. He left her with a notepad that he produced from his jacket pocket, a small, spiral-bound one, military standard, the kind that survived field conditions. She looked at it for a moment, then she sat back down on the floor and started writing. The hospital operated on the assumption that its walls contained its crises, that what happened inside them could be managed, sequenced, and resolved through the established mechanisms of institutional authority. This assumption was not entirely wrong. It was wrong in the way that most assumptions about controlled environments were wrong accurate under normal conditions, and entirely insufficient when the conditions stopped being normal. At 4:17 in the morning, the conditions stopped being normal. It started with a phone call to Terrence Hollis's personal cell from a number he didn't recognize, which he declined. The number called again, he answered on the third attempt, which happened at 4:22, and the conversation lasted 6 minutes, and at the end of it, Hollis was dressed and out of his house and on the road to Cascade Valley Medical Center. Nora did not know about this phone call until later. What she knew, at 4:27, was that the administrative floor had suddenly acquired significantly more light than it had, contained 20 minutes earlier offices opening, overhead fixtures coming on in the conference room, printer starting in the HR suite that she could hear through the wall. She was still on the floor in the corridor, but she had moved to the junction where the administrative hall met the main corridor, which gave her a sight line in 3 directions. Wick came back around the corner at 4:31. His expression had changed. Not dramatically, he was not a person whose expressions changed dramatically, but there was something in it that was moving faster than his usual operational steadiness. Hollis got a call, he said. I heard the office is open, she said. Marlene Sutter called a member of the hospital board 45 minutes ago, Dr. Raymond Schofield. He's been on the board for 9 years, and he's Marlene's former colleague from Brecken Regional, where they both worked before she came here. Wick crouched down to her level. She told him that the military presence tonight was creating a hostile clinical environment, and that the suspension of the float nurse had been improperly challenged by federal personnel with no jurisdiction over hospital operations. Nora looked at him. She told him the soldier's condition is stable, and our continued presence here is unnecessary, Wick said. Schofield called Hollis and recommended that the credentialing review be postponed until the military personnel have departed, and the situation is... He paused, his mouth doing something brief and unamused, normalized. She called in a board contact, Nora said, at 4 in the morning. That's not panic, Nora said. That's someone who has done this before. Wick looked at her. What do you mean? She thought about it for a moment, the precision of it, the timing, the existence of a board contact who was a former colleague and who could be relied upon to make the right call. This was not improvised. Nobody improvised a board-level intervention at 4 in the morning. Kept that number available. You knew exactly when to use it. Has anything like this happened here before? She said. Another staff member. Someone else who came in with credentials that didn't appear in their file. Wick was quiet. That's something to look at, she said. He stood up. I need to make another call. The post commander, she said, and the Army's legal liaison. If Schofield successfully pushes the credentialing review back, the window for the physical file to be reviewed independently closes. Records can be amended. Processes can be justified. In 2 weeks, this becomes a he said, she said between a charge nurse and a float nurse with a blank intake form. So we have a few hours, Nora said. We have less than that, if Hollis agrees with Schofield. She got up from the floor without the hand this time, because now she was moving, and she needed the motion to be entirely her own. What do you need from me? Stay visible. Stay in the building. If anyone from administration approaches you, you say nothing without me present. He looked at her. Can you do that? I've spent 2 years saying nothing, she said. 1 more night is manageable. Something moved through his expression again, that almost thing that wasn't quite a smile. He left at a pace that was faster than walking, but hadn't committed to running, which she recognized as the military version of urgency that didn't want to create alarm in observers. She stood in the corridor. She thought. At 4:50, the conference room at the end of the administrative hall opened, and Terrence Hollis walked out with Dr. Raymond Schofield, who was a tall man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having his assessments considered final. Behind them came Marlene Sutter, dressed as if she had never left the building, composed in the way that a person is composed when they have made every preparation they know how to make and are waiting to see if those preparations hold. All 3 of them stopped when they saw Nora. There was a moment. It lasted 4 seconds, which was long. Then Schofield said, Miss Calloway, I think it would be best if you went home and got some rest. The hospital will be in contact regarding your suspension review. Nora looked at him. I'm waiting for an update on my patient. You don't have a patient, Schofield said. You're a suspended staff member, the soldier who came in tonight. I was involved in his care. I'm waiting for a surgical update. The surgical team will provide updates to his military unit. Schofield's voice was patient and final in the way that authority voices tend to be patient and final when they are not accustomed to being questioned. I'll ask you to leave the building, Ms. Calloway. Nora did not move. Marlene was watching her from behind Schofield's shoulder. She had not yet spoken. Dr. Schofield, Nora said, are you the board member who received a call from Charge Nurse Sutter at approximately 3:45 this morning? The corridor was very quiet. Schofield blinked. Because if you are, she said, I'd like to note for the record that I'm asking you that question at 4:52 a.m. in the presence of witnesses, in case it becomes relevant later when the ethics board is reviewing the events of tonight. Hollis, standing to Schofield's left, made a small sound that was not quite a word. Marlene's expression shifted. It was the first time tonight that anything behind her composure had shown itself not guilt, not fear, something more like the recalibration of someone who had expected to walk into a manageable room and had found the room was not the room they had prepared for. Then from behind Nora, the stairwell door opened. Major Daniel Wick walked through it, and he was not alone. He had 2 people with him, a woman in her 40s in civilian clothes, who was nonetheless carrying herself with the particular posture of someone with military authority wearing civilian cover, and a man in his 30s with a laptop bag over one shoulder and a phone already in his hand. This is Captain Rachel Voss from the Army Judge Advocate General's office, Wick said, without preamble. And this is Mr. Grant Adley from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. They've been briefed on the credentialing issue. He looked at Schofield. Mr. Adley received a referral from our post commander approximately 30 minutes ago. He's asked for access to the hospital's personnel records for a preliminary review. In the hallway, Schofield turned to Hollis. Hollis was looking at a man who understood that the size of the problem had just been revised significantly upward. The Inspector General's office doesn't have authority over a civilian hospital's internal, Schofield began. It does when the personnel file in question belongs to a federal veteran whose military credentials were materially misrepresented in a credentialing process that affected her ability to provide care to an active duty soldier, Voss said. Her voice was pleasant and absolute. We're not here to review your hospital, Doctor Schofield. We're here to review the handling of a specific document and the chain of custody around it. That document involves federal records and military certifications. Puts it in our purview. Marlene Sutter, for the first time all night, said nothing. She was standing very still. Her arms were at her sides now, rather than crossed. The shift was small. It was significant. Hollis said, "We'll need to involve our legal counsel." "Of course," Adley said, already opening his laptop. "We'll wait." What followed was not dramatic. It was administrative in the way that consequential things often were slow, procedural, built from documents and questions, and the careful notation of responses. Legal counsel was called. The conference room was reopened. Adley requested the physical personnel files for all float nurses hired in the past 3 years, which was a scope broader than just Nora, and which, she understood, was intentional. She sat outside the conference room in a chair, this time an actual chair, placed there by a staff member who had appeared at 6 with a coffee tray, and the careful neutrality of someone who had decided to treat everyone equally because they genuinely did not know who was going to be in charge by morning. She drank the coffee. She kept the notepad on her knee. Through the conference room window, she could see the shapes of the people inside Hollis. Schofield, the hospital's legal counsel, who had arrived looking like someone who had also been woken by a phone call. Wick, Voss, Adley. Marlene was in there. She had gone in when asked and had not come back out. At 6:40, Dr. Philip Marsh arrived on the administrative floor with the look of someone tracked on a situation from the surgical recovery reports and had made a specific decision to be present. He sat down in the chair next to Nora. He had Graves' surgical report in his hand. "He's out," Marsh said. "Spleen was repaired. They preserved it. Vascular completed the amputation site assessment. The circulation is good, better than they expected." He looked at her. "He's going to wake up with his legs shorter than he went to sleep with, and his chest is going to hurt for 6 weeks, and his recovery is going to be long," she said. "Long," he agreed. "But he's alive." Nora looked at the coffee in her hand. "You were right on everything," Marsh said. "Splenic pattern, the thoracic complication, all of it." He paused. "I've been a physician for 19 years. I want you to know that what you did tonight, not just the clinical decisions, but the way you did them, the precision, the calm. I've worked with attendings who couldn't have managed it as cleanly." "It wasn't clean," she said. "No, but it was good." He looked at the conference room window. "What's happening in there?" "Credentialing review," she said, "and some other things." "The Inspector General's office," he said. He had clearly heard more than she expected. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been on staff here for 7 years. I didn't know about the intake form." "I know," she said. "I should have questioned why a float nurse with your instincts was stocking shelves for 2 years." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She said it without heat, and he received it the same way, not as an attack, but as a fact that needed to be stated and acknowledged, which was the only way either of them could move forward from it. He nodded. At 7:14, the conference room door opened. Terrence Hollis came out first, followed by the hospital's legal counsel, and then Grant Adley with his laptop and his phone. Adley stopped beside Nora's chair. "We're going to need your statement in formal writing," he said. "Everything you observed tonight regarding Charge Nurse Sutter's presence on the surgical floor, as well as your recollection of completing the intake form on your hire date. We'll also need you available for follow-up questions over the next several days." "I understand," she said. He nodded and moved on. Hollis stopped. He looked at Nora with the expression of a man who had spent the last 3 hours recalculating several things simultaneously and had arrived at a position he was not entirely comfortable with, which was the honest position. "Suspension," he said, "is under review effective immediately. You're not reinstated, not formally, not yet, but you are not required to leave the building." She looked at him. "And we will be convening the credentialing committee this morning," he said. "Full documentation." She nodded. He moved on. The last person to come out of the conference room was Marlene Sutter. She walked out alone, without Hollis, without Schofield, without the shelter of institutional positioning. She looked the same as she had looked at the beginning of the night, composed, upright, the physical bearing of someone who had survived 11 years of high-pressure environments through sheer force of consistency. But she was carrying something different now. It wasn't visible in any single feature. It was in the accumulation of them, the way her jaw was set slightly too firmly, the way her eyes moved to the floor for half a second before she corrected them upward, the way she held her arms that was no longer crossed, but had not found the natural position that crossing them had replaced. She stopped when she reached Nora. They were the only two people in the immediate corridor. "I knew you were good," Marlene said. Her voice was even. Not contrite, not yet, and possibly never. Because some people were not constructed for contrition, but stripped of the management quality that had been in it all night. It was simply a statement. Nora looked at her. "I thought you were hiding," Marlene said. "I thought if someone like you wanted to float, there was a reason that was going to blow back on this unit eventually." She paused. "I was protecting my floor." "You were wrong," Nora said. Marlene walked toward the elevator. The doors opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. Nora sat with the absence of her for a moment. The way you sit with the absence of something that has defined a space for so long that the space itself takes time to reorganize. Then Priya Desai came around the corner from the direction of the trauma unit, moving with the compressed urgency she'd used the night before. Except this time she wasn't moving toward a patient. She was moving toward Nora. She stopped in front of her and held out a paper, a printout, clinical format, with a timestamp from 11 minutes ago. "They found something in the credentialing files," Priya said. Her face was doing something complicated. "From before you. 2 other nurses. Both float. Both veterans. Both hired in the last 4 years." She looked at the paper in Nora's hand. "Their military credentials aren't in their files either." Nora looked at the printout. The names were not names she recognized. Blank sections were exactly the same as hers. 2 names on the printout were Teresa Weiland and Marcus Obi. Nora read them twice. She did not know either of them personally, but the structure of what she was looking at was immediately and completely legible. 2 nurses, 2 veterans, 2 sets of blank credentialing sections in personnel files that should have contained military training records. The dates of hire were 18 months and 11 months before her own arrival at Cascade Valley, which meant this had not started with her. She had not been the first. She had simply been the most recent, and possibly the last, because the protocol that had allowed it had been changed 8 months ago in a revision that nobody had publicly connected to anything, but which had coincidentally followed Sandra Rice's departure. "Where are they now?" Nora said. Priya shook her head. "Weiland left after 8 months. I don't know why. Obi is still here. He's on night rotation in the medical ICU." She looked at the printout. "He's been here for 2.5 years, and I don't think anyone on the trauma staff knows what his background is." "Does Adley know about this?" "I think that's where it came from. Someone in the credentialing committee pulled the files and forwarded it to him." Nora folded the printout. She put it with the notepad in her scrubs pocket, which now contained more documentation than most of her shifts had produced in 2 years. Stood up. "Where are you going?" Priya said. "To find Wick." She found him in the corridor outside the surgical floor, on his phone, with the particular stillness of someone receiving information they are processing rather than reacting to. He ended the call when he saw her expression. She handed him the printout without explanation. He read it. His face did the thing it did when information landed in an unexpected place, the small, contained adjustment. That was the closest he came to visible surprise. "Weiland and Obi," he said. 2 before me, same blank sections. Weiland left after 8 months. Obi's still on staff, MICU night rotation. Wick looked at the printout for another moment. "This changes the framing," he said. "Changes it from an isolated incident to a pattern," she said. "Which changes what Marlene can claim she was doing, and why." He nodded slowly. "A single case is a judgment call. A judgment call can be defended as administrative discretion. 3 cases with the same specific section blank, across 3 different veterans hired over 3 years. Is a practice," Nora said. He looked at her. "Adley needs to see this." Priya said it came from his review. "Then he already has it." He folded the printout and returned it to her. Which means the scope of what's happening in that conference room just expanded significantly. And Marlene is still in this building. He checked his watch. "She hasn't left yet. I asked security to note movements through the main exits." Nora looked at him. "Precautionary," he said. "Not detainment. She's free to leave whenever she wants. I just want to know when." "She hasn't left," Nora said. "No. She's waiting to see how far this goes before she decides what to do." Wick said nothing, which was agreement. The next 2 hours moved away. Institutional reckonings moved slowly, procedurally, with long intervals of nothing visible, followed by sudden compressed activity that lasted minutes and then went still again. Nora spent most of it in the corridor, and some of it in the small waiting alcove near the surgical suite, where she could track both the conference room traffic and the movement on the floor above. She was running on the specific clarity that came after the kind of night where sleep was not a realistic option, and the body had committed to wakefulness as a survival strategy. Her knee had stopped being subtle and moved into a register she would have to address with actual rest eventually. Not yet. At 8:15, Grant Adley came out of the conference room and crossed the administrative floor to where she was sitting. He sat down in the adjacent chair and opened his laptop on his knee, which was an unusual posture for a formal interview, but she did not comment on it. "I want to walk through your timeline," he said. "From your hire date to tonight. Everything you can remember about the intake process, your subsequent performance evaluations, any interactions with Charge Nurse Sutter where your military background was relevant, or where it seemed relevant even if it wasn't acknowledged." He looked at her over the laptop screen. "Take your time." She did not take a great deal of time, because she had a precise memory for sequences, and she had been mentally organizing this one since 4 in the morning. She walked him through the intake appointment, the form she had completed, the specific certifications she had listed, the section she had filled in carefully with her training history. She described the intake coordinator, Sandra Rice, whose name she had not known at the time, but whose face she remembered clearly, a woman in her mid-30s who had been professional and efficient, and who had taken the completed form with a brisk thank you. She described her first shift, her first week, the conversation with Marlene on day 1. She described the 22 months of float assignments, the supply alcove, the performance evaluations that assessed her as competent meets expectations without identifying any specialty skills. She described the night she had correctly identified Gordy Tate's tension pneumothorax and Marlene's response afterward. She described tonight from the helicopters to the hallway. Adley typed through all of it. He asked clarifying questions that were specific and precise: dates, times, names, exact language used in conversations. She answered each one as accurately as she could, and when she was uncertain about a detail, she said so rather than approximating, which he seemed to register. At the end, he said the 2 other nurses, Wyland and Obi. "Did you have interactions with either of them in your time here?" "I knew Obi by sight from night rotations. We worked adjacent floors twice. I never had a substantive conversation with him." She paused. "I didn't know Wyland. Do you know why Wyland left?" "No." Adley closed the laptop. "We're attempting to reach her. If her experience mirrors yours and Obi's, the pattern becomes significantly easier to document." He stood. "Miss Calloway, I want to be direct with you. What you're describing, and what the files are showing, is a systematic credentialing suppression across at least 3 veteran nurses. That's what the full investigation confirms. The consequences for the individuals responsible will extend well beyond hospital disciplinary proceedings." She looked at him. "I'm not making promises," he said. "I'm telling you the scope." She nodded. He went back to the conference room. Nora sat with the word systematic for a moment. It was the right word. She had been thinking it without saying it, since she read the printout, because once you said it, it became a different kind of truth, not a personal injustice, not a charge nurse's bad judgment, but a constructed environment in which a specific category of people were consistently and deliberately kept below their competence level, which meant below their ability to act, which meant below their ability to interfere. She thought about what Marlene had said in the corridor. "I was protecting my floor." She thought about that framing now with the printout in her pocket and 3 names instead of 1. Protecting a floor meant controlling what happened on it. Controlling what happened on it meant controlling who had the authority to affect outcomes. And veterans with combat medical training had the specific and inconvenient quality of knowing exactly what good clinical decision-making looked like, which made them harder to manage if you were running a unit on the basis of institutional hierarchy rather than actual competence. It was not, she decided, that Marlene had set out to harm anyone. The harm had been the byproduct of a control strategy, which was in some ways worse than intentional cruelty because it was more durable, more defensible, and more difficult to name. She stood up. She needed to see Obi. Marcus Obi was ending a 12-hour night shift in the medical ICU when Nora found him, which meant he was doing the particular end-of-shift movement of a person who had been alert for 12 hours and was now allowing themselves to decompress in increments. He was at the nursing station, charting the last of his notes. Tall man with a quiet face and the particular economy of movement that people developed after years of working in high-pressure environments where unnecessary motion was its own kind of inefficiency. She had seen him before. She had not known what she was looking at. She sat down in the empty chair at the station beside him. He glanced at her, a float nurse he recognized by sight from corridor interactions over 20-odd months. Nothing more, and returned to his charting. "I'm Nora Calloway," she said. "I work trauma and float. I'm suspended right now, technically, but that's what I'm here about." Stop charting. He turned to look at her fully. "Marcus Obi," he said, which she knew, but he said it in the way people say their names when they are deciding to be present in a conversation rather than adjacent to it. "Your intake form from 2.5 years ago," she said. "The section on military credentials." His expression shifted not dramatically, but in the specific way that someone's expression shifts when something they have kept in a particular internal location gets named by someone from outside. "What about it?" he said. "Was it blank when you filed it?" He held her gaze. "No, it's blank in your personnel file." A long moment. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I noticed after my first performance evaluation," he said. "I went to HR to question it, because the evaluation didn't reflect skills I'd listed at intake, and the woman in HR showed me my file, and the section was empty." He paused. "Told it was probably a scanning error, and they'd look into it. Nothing happened. I raised it again 6 months later. I was told the committee would review it when I came up for my annual evaluation." He looked at his hands on the keyboard. "I never came up for an annual evaluation. My contract got reclassified to open-ended float status, and the evaluation stopped." "Did you report it formally?" "I put it in writing once." To charge Nurse Sutter. His voice was even. She responded in writing that my concerns had been noted and would be reviewed through the appropriate process. And nothing. "I was assigned to the MCU on nights and I stopped pushing it." He was quiet for a moment. "I have a family. I needed the job." He looked at her. "Told myself it didn't matter." "It mattered," she said. "I know that now." She told him about Adley, about the Inspector General's review, about what the credentialing committee had found in the files. She told him about her own intake form and about Weiland. She did not editorialize or project. She gave him the information and let it land. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "Teresa Weiland," he said finally. "I worked with her. Briefly. She was good. Army. Combat medic background similar to yours." He paused. "She left. She told me on her last shift that she was done being invisible." He looked at the nursing station. "I didn't ask her what she meant." "Adley is trying to reach her," Nora said. "She's in Billings. I have her number somewhere." He pulled out his phone. They sat at the nursing station together while he scrolled through his contacts, and Nora thought about the three of them herself. Obi, Weiland distributed across the hospital and across time, each of them carrying the same blank space in the same section of the same form, each of them having found individual ways to manage it that had collectively amounted to nothing, because that was how this kind of thing worked. It worked because it isolated. It worked because each person assumed their situation was specific to them and addressed it accordingly, which meant addressing it alone, which meant not addressing it at all. He found the number. He wrote it on a piece of paper and handed it to her. She took it to Adley. The credentialing committee convened at 9:30 in the hospital's main boardroom, which was a different room from the administrative conference room, larger, with a long table and enough chairs to seat the committee members plus the assembled witnesses and representatives that the morning had produced. Nora had not been inside a boardroom this size since an Army After Action review 3 years ago, and the ambient atmosphere of institutional gravity felt familiar enough that she could navigate it. She sat along the wall, not at the table. Wick sat beside her. Voss was at the table, at the far end. Adley sat adjacent to the committee chair with his laptop, and 3 printed reports that she could not read from this distance. Hollis opened the meeting with a procedural statement about the scope of the review and the hospital's commitment to addressing credentialing irregularities as a matter of patient safety and institutional integrity. It was the language of a man who had spent the night recalibrating and had arrived at a position that required him to be visibly on the right side of the outcome. Marlene Sutter was at the table. She had, apparently, agreed to be present voluntarily, which told Nora something. Marlene's legal counsel was beside her, a woman who had arrived at 8 with a briefcase and the expression of someone who had been called very early in the morning and had decided that full engagement was the right approach. The attorney's presence confirmed what Nora had suspected. Marlene had understood by this point that the framing had shifted from a protocol dispute to something that required a lawyer, and she had made the call to be in the room anyway, which meant she believed she could still shape what happened in it. The committee chair, a physician named Dr. Ingrid Cole, who had a reputation for forensic precision that Nora had heard referenced exactly once in 2 years, but which was already apparent in the way she organized her papers before speaking, opened the formal record. Committee is convening on an emergency basis to review 3 personnel files from the float nursing pool and to assess the integrity of the credentialing process that produced them, Cole said. We will hear from the Department of Defense Inspector General's representative, from the affected personnel, and from the charge nurse supervisor of record for the relevant hiring periods. This review is being conducted formally and will be submitted to the hospital's ethics board upon completion. She looked at Marlene. Marlene looked back at her without flinching. The first hour was documentary. Adley presented his findings with the precision of someone who understood that institutional processes lived and died on documentation. The 3 intake forms, the 3 blank sections, the timestamp records from the HR system showing the forms had been accessed and modified after submission, the chain of custody records that tied each modification to a supervisor-level access credential. The room went very still when the access records came up. Supervisor-level credential that had accessed all 3 files, in each case within a week of the initial submission, was registered to Marlene Sutter. Her attorney said, "Supervisor access is routinely used for file review. Access does not establish modification." "Correct," Adley said, "which is why we pulled the system's edit logs." He produced another printout. These logs record field-level changes. In each of the 3 files, the military credentials field was cleared, not left blank from submission, but cleared after submission. Edit timestamps correspond to the supervisor access sessions. Marlene's attorney wrote something on her notepad. Marlene looked at the table. The second hour was testimony. Nora spoke. Obi spoke. Cole asked questions that were specific and chronological, and each answer built on the previous one in the way that testimony built when the underlying facts were consistent across multiple independent accounts. Nora noticed that Dr. Marsh was also present, seated at the back of the room, and that he had a copy of the clinical record from last night in front of him, and that he did not look at Marlene once during the entire proceeding. When it was Marlene's turn, she spoke through her attorney, who read a prepared statement that acknowledged administrative responsibility for the float nurse credentialing process during the relevant period and expressed the charge nurse's willingness to cooperate with the ongoing review. Cole listened to the statement. Then she set down her pen. "Ms. Sutter," she said, "I'm going to ask you directly, and I'd like you to answer directly. Were you aware that the military credentials sections in these 3 personnel files had been cleared after submission?" Marlene's attorney started to speak. "I'm asking Ms. Sutter," Cole said. A silence. Marlene looked at Dr. Cole. "Yes," she said. The room absorbed this. Her attorney closed her eyes briefly. "And were you the individual who cleared them?" Cole said. Another silence. Longer. "Yes," Marlene said. The attorney put her pen down. "My reasons," Marlene began. "We'll hear your reasons," Cole said. "But I want the committee to be clear on what we've just established before we proceed." What they had established was sufficient. Nora could read the committee members' expressions, the particular compression that happened when facts aligned in a way that left no interpretive space. The reasons would be heard, and they would be entered into the record, and they would not change the weight of what had just been admitted. Marlene's reasons, when she gave them, were exactly what she had said in the corridor: protecting her floor, managing liability, a belief that veterans returning to civilian nursing in subordinate roles had often left the military for reasons that required careful management. She said it without self-pity, without deflection, in the same even voice she used for everything. And it was somehow worse that way, worse than if she had been defensive or tearful, because the evenness made clear that she had believed this was a reasonable position to hold, and had acted on it consistently, and had never once applied the obvious test of asking the people she was managing whether she was right about them. When she finished, the room was quiet. Cole looked at the committee. "We'll recess for 30 minutes, she said. The recess was 35 minutes, which meant the deliberation was not clean. Nora waited in the corridor with Wick, who had his phone out, and was managing communications with Fort Callum in the intervals between the committee's movements. Obi had left to go home after testifying she had told him to, because he had worked 12 hours, and there was nothing further he needed to be present for. And he had gone with the look of someone for whom the morning had reorganized several things that had been in the wrong positions for a long time. Priya Desai's appeared at 11:43 and sat down next to Nora without saying anything, which Nora took as a form of solidarity that she neither needed nor rejected. At 11:50, the boardroom door opened. Cole came out first. She crossed the corridor to where Nora was sitting. "Committee has reached a preliminary determination," she said. "Charge Nurse Sutter has been removed from her supervisory position effective immediately, pending a formal disciplinary proceeding. The 3 personnel files will be amended to reflect the complete military credentials of each nurse. A review of the float nurse credentialing process has been ordered, covering the last 5 years." She paused. "Suspension is rescinded effective now." Nora looked at her. "Committee would like to formally apologize on behalf of this institution for what happened to your credentials," Cole said. "I'll be honest with you that apology is insufficient relative to what was done. We know that." "I know you know that," Nora said. Cole held her gaze for a moment. "There will be more to discuss. About your role going forward, about what the hospital can do to address this properly. That conversation can wait until you've had some rest." She went back inside. Wick was watching Nora. "How are you?" he said. She thought about it. Her knee was in significant pain. She had been awake for over 24 hours. She had a notepad full of documentation in her pocket of rescinded suspension, and the particular feeling that came after an adrenaline-sustained night, when the adrenaline began to lift and the weight of everything that had happened settled into the body as something that would need to be processed over time rather than all at once. "I'm standing," she said. "That'll do," he said. At 12:30, she was walking toward the exit, toward her truck in the parking structure, toward her apartment, with its organized bathroom shelf and its 2 quiet rooms when Hollis stopped her. He was alone. No clipboard, no Gail Purcell, no institutional buffer. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I want you to know that the board is going to want to discuss your future role here, formally and with full consideration of your complete record." He paused. "What that looks like is your decision, not ours. But I want you to know the conversation is open." She looked at him. He was a man who had spent the night making the right calls approximately 30 minutes later than they should have been made, which was not courage, but was something in the direction of it. "I know," she said. She walked out. The parking structure was cold and smelled of exhaust and old concrete. Her truck was on the 2nd level, and the elevator was out of service, which her knee made very clear was an opinion she was overruling. She climbed them with the handrail and reached the truck and sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting it. Cracked dashboard, the AM radio, the apartment at the edge of town. She had come here to be small, and she had been made smaller than she intended by someone else's calculation, and both of those things were true at the same time, and she did not know yet what she was going to do with either of them. Started the truck. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She picked it up. Unknown number. She almost set it down. She answered. "Miss Calloway." A woman's voice. Clear, direct, with the particular cadence of someone accustomed to institutional communications. "My name is Teresa Weiland. Major Wick gave me this number. He said I should call you." A pause. "I heard what happened last night. I heard what you did." Another pause, and in it something that was not quite composed. "I left because I thought I was alone in it. I thought it was just me." Nora looked at the cracked dashboard. "You weren't alone," she said. "I know that now." Weiland's voice steadied. "The Inspector General's office is asking me to give a formal statement. I'm going to do it." She paused. "But I wanted to call you first, because you stayed. You stayed when I didn't." Nora held the phone. "Almost didn't," she said. "But you did," Weiland said. "And Obi is still there. And apparently, there's an investigation that goes back 5 years, and Adley says the scope might be wider than Cascade Valley." Nora went still. "Wider," she said. "He thinks the same pattern may appear at affiliated facilities," Weiland said. "Hospitals in the same regional network that used the same credentialing software update, the same float nurse intake protocol, the same—" She stopped. He said it the way someone says something, when they've found the first piece of something much larger. Nora stared at the parking structure wall in front of her truck. The same protocol, the same software, The same chain of custody. Cascade Valley was part of a regional network. 4 hospitals, shared administrative systems, shared HR software deployed in a coordinated rollout 3 years ago, which was the same 3 years in which Wyland, Obi, and Nora had all been hired and had all had the same section of the same form cleared. How many hospitals, she said. He didn't say, Wyland said. But he asked me whether I had contact with nurses from Ridgemont Valley or the Sutter Creek facility, and those are both network hospitals. Nora looked at her hand on the steering wheel. The investigation that Adley had described as being about 3 personnel files had just become something that was not about 3 personnel files. She thought about all the supply alcoves in all the hospitals in this network, all the float nurses stocking gloves, all the blank sections. Phone buzzed with a second call. She looked at the screen. Adley. She told Wyland she would call her back and switched to Adley's call before the second ring finished. Miss Calloway. His voice had the quality of someone who had been moving fast for several hours and had not slowed down. Are you still in the building? Parking structure, she said. Was leaving. I need you to come back inside. She looked at the parking structure wall. Wyland just told me about the network hospitals. A brief pause. Then you understand why I need you inside. He paused again. We've been pulling the HR system logs for the affiliated facilities, Ridgemont Valley and Sutter Creek. The same supervisor-level credential modifications appear in their float nurse intake files. Different charge nurses at both locations, but the same software, the same field, the same pattern. His voice was steady and factual, and underneath the steadiness was something that she recognized as controlled urgency. Nora. We're looking at potentially 17 additional nurses across 3 facilities over 5 years. She sat with that number. 17, not 3. Not a single unit's worth of bad decisions. 17 people who had arrived at hospitals in this network, carrying military medical training, and had been systematically reduced to the tasks that nobody else wanted, distributed across facilities, isolated from each other, each one handling it alone in whatever way they had managed leaving, accepting it, building small lives in supply alcoves. Who ran the protocol rollout, she said. The HR software implementation. Who managed it across all 4 facilities? That's what I need you inside for, Adley said. She got out of the truck. The answer, when it came, did not come from the software logs or the HR records or the Inspector General's preliminary findings. It came from a filing cabinet in the Regional Administrative Office on the 4th floor of Cascade Valley, a floor Nora had never been on in 22 months, because float nurses did not go to the Regional Administrative floor, which was, of course, part of the point. The Regional Administrative Office was occupied by a man named Victor Hale, who carried the title of Regional Director of Clinical Operations, and who had, until approximately 40 minutes ago, been conducting his Wednesday morning in the ordered and unremarkable manner of someone who believed the ground beneath him was stable. He was in his mid-50s, with the presentation of institutional authority, good suit, careful posture, the particular grooming of a man who had decided that appearance was load-bearing in his professional environment. He had been at his desk when Adley and Voss arrived. He had offered coffee. He had expressed full cooperation. He had stopped expressing full cooperation when Adley opened the regional system logs on his laptop and showed him the supervisor-level credential structure, because the supervisor-level credential that had been used to modify files at Ridgemont Valley and Sutter Creek was not registered to the charge nurses at those facilities. Those charge nurses had their own access credentials. The modifications at the affiliated hospitals had been made through a regional administrator account, an account that sat above individual facility credentials that could access files across all 4 network hospitals simultaneously that had been created during the HR software rollout and had been used quietly and periodically over 5 years. That account was registered to Victor Hale. Nora was not in the room when this was established. She was in the corridor outside, because Adley had asked her to wait there, and she was waiting with the particular patience of someone who had learned that the most important things often happened in rooms you were not invited into. Wick was beside her. He had not said anything in 15 minutes, which was its own kind of company. She heard Hale's voice once, through the door raised, controlled in the way that voices were controlled, when the person was working hard not to let the control slip, and then she did not hear it again at that volume. At 1:15, Voss came out of the office. She stood in front of Nora and said, Victor Hale implemented the credentialing suppression protocol as a regional policy. The charge nurses at the affiliated facilities were instructed through what they believed to be a legitimate administrative directive to clear the military credential sections for veteran float nurses during a probationary review period. They were told it was a liability management measure related to scope of practice insurance coverage. She paused. Most of them complied because it was presented as policy from above. Marlene Sutter complied and went further. She did not simply follow the directive. She built her own rationale around it and operated independently of it after the first year. So Marlene didn't start it, Nora said. No, but she sustained it, and she added her own layer to it, and she protected it when it should have ended. Voss looked at her. Hale created the system. Sutter made it personal. Nora looked at the closed office door. What happens to him, she said. The IG referral goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Voss said. The credentials that were suppressed are federal military records. Modifying them as part of a policy designed to limit veteran nurses' advancement in federally licensed facilities crosses into federal territory. Where that lands is not my decision, but the referral is being made today. And Marlene. The hospital's disciplinary proceeding is already in motion. The IG's findings go into that record. What the ethics board and the board of directors decide from there is their process to run. Voss paused. But she admitted to the committee on record. That admission is not going anywhere. Wick said, what about the nurses? The 17. Every file in the network gets reviewed. Every affected nurse gets contacted. Every credential section gets restored. And every individual gets a formal review of their employment history to assess whether their placement and advancement was materially affected by the suppression. Voss looked between them. That process is going to take time. It's not going to be fast or clean. It's going to happen. She went back inside. Nora looked at the closed door again. 17 nurses, 5 years, 4 hospitals, a regional administrator who had decided that military medical training in a subordinate clinical role was a liability variable to be managed rather than a resource to be used, and who had built a system around that decision so quietly and procedurally that it had run for half a decade without anyone looking at it directly. She thought about all the things that had not happened because of those blank sections, the diagnoses that had been slower, the decisions that had been delayed because the person who saw the answer fastest was not in the room or was in the room, but did not have the authority to say what they saw. The Gordy Tates in other hospitals who had maybe not been as lucky, the soldiers and the ordinary patients, and the people who had come in frightened and sick and trusting that the best available person was the one standing over them. She did not know how to quantify that. She suspected nobody did. She leaned against the corridor wall and let her knee take the position it needed, and she stayed there until the weight of the ceiling stopped feeling like it was pressing down and started feeling like it was simply the ceiling. The formal credentialing committee determination was issued at 3 in the afternoon, in a document that Hollis had clearly spent considerable time ensuring was unambiguous. Nora sat in the conference room on the administrative floor, the same round table, the same blue marker residue, on the whiteboard, and read it while Dr. Cole sat across from her. The determination restored her military credentials to her personnel file in full, classified her existing performance evaluations as materially incomplete due to the credential suppression, and ordered them voided and removed from her record, formally cleared every action she had taken during the preceding 24 hours, including the needle decompression, the chest tube preparation, and her intervention in Recovery Suite 4, consistent with her actual qualifications and within her legitimate scope of practice. It also included a recommendation, Cole said. The committee is recommending that the hospital create a senior trauma specialist position, a designation that doesn't currently exist in our structure. It would sit between staff nurse and attending in terms of clinical authority, designed for nurses with advanced field experience who can provide a level of assessment and intervention that our current structure doesn't have a category for. She looked at Nora. We're recommending you for that position, not because of last night specifically, but because your credentials have always supported it. Last night just made it visible. Nora read the recommendation section of the document again. The salary adjustment would be significant, Cole said. The authority structure gives you direct clinical decision-making capacity within defined emergency parameters with full attending consultation for anything outside those parameters. You'd also be asked to develop a trauma protocol training module for nursing staff, incorporating field medical principles into standard emergency response. She paused. You don't have to decide today. Nora set the document down. I want to think about the training component, she said. Position itself, yes. Cole looked at her. The training component. I want to build it correctly. Not just a module. A structural change to how this unit assesses experience. She looked at Cole. Obi should be reviewed for a similar designation. His MIC Hugh worked for 2.5 years without proper credentialing means we don't have a clear picture of what he's actually been doing. That needs to be looked at honestly. Cole wrote something. We'll initiate his review as part of the broader process. And the affiliate hospitals, Nora said. The nurses there, when their files are corrected, they should be contacted individually and given the option to discuss their roles, not by HR, by someone who actually understands what their training means clinically. Is that something you'd be willing to do? Nora thought about Teresa Weiland on the phone, saying I thought I was alone in it. She thought about Marcus Obi, saying I told myself it didn't matter. She thought about her own 22 months in the supply alcove, the precise and particular invisibility she had constructed, the way she had told herself it was a choice when it had only partly been one. Yes, she said. Cole closed her folder. There's one more thing, she said. The hospital is prepared to offer a formal written apology to you, to Mr. Obi, and to Ms. Weiland. It will be entered into your personnel records and made available for any professional reference purposes. She paused. I want to say something outside of the formal record, if that's acceptable. Nora looked at her. What happened to you here was not a system failure, Cole said. System failures are accidents. This was a deliberate construction by people who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. The fact that it ran for 5 years in a facility I've been on staff at for 3 of those years is something I'm going to be carrying for a long time. She held Nora's gaze. I'm sorry it happened here. I'm sorry it took a dying soldier and a military intervention for us to look at it. Nora was quiet for a moment. The soldier is alive, she said. Start there. Cole nodded. Graves was moved out of the surgical ICU and into a step-down room on the 3rd floor 4 days after his surgery. Nora knew this because Wick told her, not because she had been monitoring his progress. She had been home for most of those 4 days, sleeping in chunks and doing her stretches and eating actual meals and letting her knee begin the slow work of recovery that she had been deferring for longer than she should have. She had also been on the phone with Adley twice, with Teresa Weiland once more, and with the HR director at Ridgemont Valley, in a conversation that had been uncomfortable for all parties and necessary for all parties, and which had ended with Nora giving the HR director a list of specific questions to ask when they reviewed the affected nurse's files. She returned to Cascade Valley on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the helicopters landed, wearing the same Navy scrubs she had always worn, because she had not yet updated her wardrobe, and she was not sure she would. Supply alcove on the east side of the trauma unit was fully stocked. Someone had reorganized it in her absence, and she could see from the doorway that the chest tube kits were now stored separately from the general supply shelves, with a laminated inventory card attached to the cabinet, which was something she had suggested in writing to Marlene twice over 2 years, and which had now apparently been implemented. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. Then she walked past it. Her new position had not officially started. Yet the paperwork was in process, the training module was in early design, the formal announcement to staff was pending the completion of HR documentation. But Dr. Cole had told her she was cleared to return to clinical work in the trauma unit under her restored credentials while the administrative pieces finished moving. She was on shift at 7. It was 6:53. Priya Desai was at the nursing station when Nora came through. She looked up, and something in her expression was uncertain in the way that people were uncertain when they didn't know what register a changed relationship required. Hi, Priya said. Hi, Nora said. A pause. The chest tube kits, Priya said, nodding toward the alcove. I reorganized them. I found your old note in the charge nurse binder, the one you submitted about the storage protocol. I saw, Nora said. It was a good note, Priya said. She said it plainly, without performance. Thank you, Nora said. She meant it. She went to work. The shift was a medium-intensity Wednesday, a fall from a construction site, 2 cardiac events, a pediatric respiratory case that required focus and patience, and a level of parental management that she had always been quietly good at. She worked alongside the trauma team the way she had always worked alongside them. Except that now when she identified something and said so, Nobody looked at her and then looked at the attending to confirm she was allowed to have noticed it. The attending, who was not Marsh but a younger physician named Dr. Sandra Kraft, who had been on staff for 14 months and who had apparently received a very thorough briefing on recent events, treated her clinical assessments with the same weight she gave her own. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. At 11 in the morning, she got a message from Wick that Graves was asking whether she had time to stop by. She finished her charting on the construction site patient, handed off to Priya, and took the elevator to the third floor. Room 318 was a standard step-down room, better than the ICU, quieter, with a window that faced the parking structure, which was not a scenic view but admitted real light at this hour. Graves was in the bed, with the elevation adjusted to sitting, his right leg ending where it ended, the amputation site dressed and clean, his color completely different from the gray-white she had last seen him in. He was thinner than his file photo, which she had seen when Wick showed her the unit records. He had the particular quality of someone who was in significant physical pain and had decided not to lead with it. Wick was in the chair by the window. He stood when she came in, not out of ceremony, but out of the habit of someone who did not sit when there was something active happening. "Hey," Graves said. "Hey," she said. She pulled the other chair to the bedside and sat, because standing over a patient in a bed was a choice she did not like making when she did not need to. He looked at her for a moment. He had dark eyes and a face that had been weathered before this and was more weathered now, and the weathering was honest rather than performed, which she respected. "Wick told me," he said. "What happened here while I was under?" "Most of it," she said. "The whole 5-year thing." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the fact that if we hadn't been looking for you specifically, if the extraction had gone differently and I'd come in as an unknown casualty, none of it gets found. You stay in the alcove. Obi stays in the MCU, Wyland stays in Billings." He looked at his hands. "And Hale keeps running it." "Probably," she said. "It's a difficult thing to sit with." "Yes," she said. "It is." She did not try to resolve it for him because it did not resolve. It was the kind of fact that you sat with until it became part of the landscape, and then you kept working anyway, because the alternative was to stop working, and stopping was not the same as the problem going away. Graves reached to the side table and picked up something she hadn't registered when she came in. A small folded square of fabric. He held it out. She took it and unfolded it. A unit patched the insignia of the recovery team he ran with, the one Wick commanded, a design she did not recognize, but whose structure she knew the meaning of. The kind of patch that moved between soldiers as an acknowledgement that was both personal and institutional, and neither fully reducible to the other. "Kept me alive," he said. "Twice, the way Wick tells it." "The surgical team kept you alive," she said. "I bought time." "Buying time is the job," he said. "You know that." She did know that. She had always known it. Buying time was the entire vocabulary of field medicine. You were never curing anyone in a foxhole. You were keeping them in the game long enough for the next level of care to reach them, and everything you did was in service of that interval. And the interval was everything. She folded the patch along its original crease. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. She stayed for another 20 minutes, talking about his recovery plan, the prosthetic timeline, the outpatient rehabilitation facility that Wick had arranged near Fort Callum. She talked about it clinically and practically and without false brightness, because he was a person who had made operational decisions for a living, and he did not need her to soften the math. He asked good questions, and she answered them honestly, including the one about phantom pain, which was a question that people often did not ask, because they did not want to be told what the answer was, but he asked it, and she told him. And he absorbed the answer with the same composure he seemed to bring to everything. When she left, Wick walked her to the elevator. "She gave a formal statement," he said. "Adley's office." "I know." She told me the U.S. attorney accepted the referral on Hale. He looked at the elevator panel. "Going to take a long time. These things always take longer than they should." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her. "You seem different." "Thought about this." "I'm the same," she said. "I'm just not pretending to be less." The elevator arrived. She stepped in. He held the doors for a half-second, the way people did when they had one more thing they were deciding whether to say. "Beacon," he said. She looked at him. "It was a good call sign," he said, "for what it's worth." The doors closed. The formal announcement of Nora's senior trauma specialist position went to staff on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks later, in an all-hands email from Hollis that included a clinical description of the role, a summary of the credentialing review and its outcomes, and a brief statement about the hospital's commitment to reform the intake process for returning military personnel across the regional network. The email did not use the word scandal. It did not need to. Marlene Sutter's disciplinary proceeding concluded the following week. Ethics Board's determination was entered into the public record because a board member had requested transparency, which Nora suspected had not been Hollis's preference, but which she considered the correct decision. The determination found Marlene Sutter guilty of deliberate credentialing misconduct, professional misrepresentation, and conduct unbecoming a clinical supervisor. She was permanently barred from holding a supervisory or charge position in any facility within the regional network. Her nursing's license remained intact. The Ethics Board had debated this, and the record showed the debate, but with a formal notation that would accompany any future license verification request. It was not the most severe outcome possible. Nora knew some people thought it should have been more. She was not sure she disagreed with them. But the notation was permanent, and the bar from supervisory positions was permanent, and the record was public, and that meant that every future place Marlene Sutter went, the truth would go with her, which was not nothing. It was what accountability looked like when it was applied to someone who had spent 11 years making herself the institution rather than a person within it. Victor Hale's federal case moved slowly, as federal cases did. Adley called Nora twice in the first month, with updates the scope of discovery had expanded to include email records and administrative memos, and there were indications that the credential clearing directive had been discussed at a level of Hale's, which meant the case might go further up the administrative chain before it resolved. She did not know what to do with that information, except add it to the pile of things she was holding until they had a final shape. She focused on what she could affect directly. The trauma protocol training module took 6 weeks to develop, which was longer than she had initially planned and shorter than it probably should have been, and it was imperfect in the way that things built quickly under pressure were imperfect. She could already see 3 sections that needed expansion, 2 that needed to be reordered, and 1 exercise scenario that she had written at 11 at night that read in morning light like something she would revise. She submitted it anyway. Perfect was not the deliverable. Usable and true was the deliverable. The first training session ran on a Tuesday with 9 nursing staff, 3 residents, and Dr. Sandra Kraft, who had asked to attend as an observer and who had taken more notes than anyone else in the room. Nora stood at the front of the conference room, a different conference room than the one she associated with the events of 6 weeks ago, and she went through the field medical principles she was translating into civilian emergency protocols, and she could see in the room's various faces the specific recalibration that happened when people encountered information that reorganized something they thought they already understood. She was not a natural teacher in the sense of someone who made it look effortless. Stopped twice to correct herself. She answered 1 question wrong and then caught the error and corrected it, which she did out loud because she had decided early that the training would not pretend competence was the same as certainty. She stumbled over a phrase in the hemorrhage control section because she had said a version of it so many times in actual emergencies that saying it in a training room felt wrong in a way that was hard to explain, and she tried to explain it anyway. At the end of the session, Kraft came up to her. "The part about time and interval," Kraft said, "buying time being the job. I want to use that framing in how I teach residents about triage priority." "Use it," Nora said. "Is it yours?" "I want to cite it correctly." Nora looked at her. "It's not mine. It's just true." Kraft wrote something in her notes. Marcus Obi received his formal senior clinical specialist designation in the IMCU in the same week as Nora's training session. She knew this because he texted her a short message, the kind of text that a person sent when they had more to say than the medium accommodated and had decided to trust the brevity. "Got the designation. Thank you for going back inside that morning." She wrote back, "You were already there. I just helped make it count." He sent a single period in response, which she understood as agreement. Teresa Lynn's situation was more complicated because she had left, and leaving created a different kind of reckoning than staying. Her personnel file at Cascade Valley was corrected in full. The formal apology letter was issued. The regional HR director made contact with her 3 times before she agreed to a call, and Nora was not on that call, but she heard from Weiland afterward. "They offered me a position," Weiland said, "at Ridgemont Valley. They said they'd build something appropriate to my credentials." "What did you say?" Nora said. "I said I'd think about it. A pause. I left because I thought I had to. I'm not sure I want to go back, just because they've decided they were wrong. It's a fair position, Nora said. Is it what you would do? Nora considered the question. I don't know what I would do in your specific situation. I stayed partly because I had nowhere else I was trying to go. It's not the same as courage. Maybe not, Wyland said. But you stayed, and it matters that you did. There was a truth in that Nora did not deflect. She had learned in the past weeks that deflecting true things was its own kind of dishonesty, and she had done enough of that variety of dishonesty quieter than lying, more sustainable and more damaging over time. You don't have to decide for them, Nora said. Decide for you. Wyland said she would. The call ended. 6 weeks after the helicopters landed, Nora started a shift at 7 in the morning, and it was an ordinary shift in the way that no shift in a trauma unit was entirely ordinary, but in the way that ordinary had meaning relative to what preceded it. She worked 4 cases. She supervised a second-year nurse on a hemodynamic assessment and corrected his landmark location without making it a learning moment in the performative sense, just pointed at the right spot and said, "Try there," and moved on. She ate lunch in the break room at the regular hour, which was a small adjustment that she had made deliberately, and 2 of the nurses were there, and they talked about something she did not have a strong opinion about, and she contributed anyway, because having a strong opinion was not actually the price of entry to a conversation. At the end of her shift, she was finishing her charting when Priya came and sat across from her. First session went well, Priya said. The training module. I heard from 2 of the residents. It has problems, Nora said. I'm revising sections 2 and 4. Yeah, but they're talking about it. The residents. In the way they talk when something actually landed. Priya looked at her. That's not nothing. No, Nora said. It's not. She finished her charting. She stood up. She passed the supply alcove on her way to the exit, and she looked at it, the organized shelves, the inventory card on the chest tube cabinet, the buzzing light that had been replaced with one that worked correctly. It was a good supply alcove. It had always been a good supply alcove because she had kept it that way for 2 years with the same competence she had applied to everything, which was the specific irony at the center of the whole story. She had been invisible for so long, partly because she was good at being invisible, and she had been good at being invisible because she was good at everything she decided to do, and neither the goodness nor the invisibility had ever been the problem. The problem had been the people who decided the invisibility was convenient and helped it along. She did not stop at the alcove. She kept walking through the trauma bay where a resident was consulting with Kraft on a chest x-ray, past the nursing station where the overnight shift was beginning to arrive, the doors that had shaken on their hinges 6 weeks ago, when 3 Black Hawks dropped out of a clear Montana sky, and everything that was going to change began to change. Outside, the evening was cold in the way that Montana evenings were cold in early spring, not punishing yet, but honest. The parking structure lights were on. Her truck was where she had left it. Cracked dashboard, AM radio, the familiar interior smell of old coffee, and the anti-inflammatory cream she kept in the center console. She sat in the driver's seat. She did not start the truck immediately. She sat with the day for a moment, the ordinary, imperfect, unspectacular day of a person doing work she was qualified to do, in a place that now knew she was qualified to do it. She sat with the knee that still ached on cold evenings and would continue to ache on cold evenings for the foreseeable future. She sat with the memory of Graves' unit patch in her hand, and Wyland on the phone saying, "I thought I was alone in it," and Obi's text, and Cole's apology that was inadequate and necessary at the same time. And all of it together made a shape she did not have a clean word for. Justice was one word people would use, and it was not entirely wrong. Vindication was another, and that one felt slightly off, because vindication implied she had set someone else's recognition to confirm something that had always been true. What had been true was always true. The supply alcove had not changed what she was. The blank section in the form had not changed what she was. 22 months of invisibility had not changed what she was. What had changed was whether the room she was standing in knew it. And rooms mattered. You could be exactly who you were in private indefinitely, carrying every credential and every skill and every hard-earned instinct from every deployment and every field surgery and every midnight, in a place that wanted to make you stop, and it would keep you intact. It would keep you yourself. But it would not help the person bleeding on the table who needed someone to step forward and know what to do. It would not help Gordy Tate. It would not help Graves. It would not help whoever came through those doors tomorrow that Nora had not yet imagined. The invisibility had always had a cost. She had just been the only one paying it for a long time. Started the truck. The AM radio came on automatically, some voice talking about something she did not track. Turned it off. The parking structure was quiet. She backed out and took the ramp down to the exit and drove toward the edge of town where her apartment was, where the rent was low and the neighbors minded their own business, and the bathroom shelf held its organized row of medications that her knee required. She drove past the turnoff to her street. She kept going for a few blocks, not with a destination in mind, just driving the way you drove sometimes, when the day needed a little more room than a parking structure and a direct route home could give it. The town was small enough that a few blocks took you somewhere quieter, where the streetlights were farther apart and the mountains were visible to the west against the evening sky. She pulled to the side of the road and looked at them. She had not looked at the mountains since she arrived in Kettler. She had been looking at floors and supply carts and the middle distance of institutional interiors for 22 months. And before that, she had been looking at terrain for very different reasons. And somewhere in the transition, she had stopped looking at things that did not require her to be ready for them. The mountains were there. They had been there the whole time. She sat with them for a while. Then she turned around and drove home, because she had an early shift tomorrow, and the second revision of the training module was due to coal by Friday, and Marcus Obi had mentioned that one of the MICU nurses was a former Navy corpsman whose file probably needed reviewing, and there was a list starting in her head of things that needed doing that was different from the lists she had kept before, less about staying out of the way, and more about the direction she intended to move in. She was not fixed. She was not the person she had been before the deployment that ended with a damaged knee and memories she still did not discuss and would not discuss tonight. She was not the person she had been during those deployment either, the one who had moved through impossibly high-stakes situations, with a certainty she had sometimes mistaken for invulnerability. She was the person who existed, after all of that, carrying the weight of it, working with it, some days managed by it and other days managing it, which was the realistic accounting of anyone who had done what she had done and kept going. She parked in front of her building. She sat for one more moment. The woman who had come to Kettler to disappear had spent 22 months succeeding at disappearing. And then one night 3 helicopters had dropped out of the sky, and a dying soldier had asked for her by name, and someone had shouted, "Where is Beacon?" across a trauma bay full of people who did not know what that word meant, and she had stepped out of the supply alcove. Not because she was ready, not because the conditions were right, not because she had resolved everything she was carrying or healed the knee or made peace with the past in any complete or tidy way. She had stepped out because there was a man dying and she knew what to do, and not stepping out was its own kind of decision. And she had finally stopped being able to make that decision. That was all it had been. One step forward in one corridor when one person needed what she had. Everything else had followed from that. She got out of the truck. She went inside. She did her stretches in the dark before she turned on the lights, the same way she always did, and the knee complained, the same way it always did, and she worked through it, the same way she always worked through it. Some things did not change, but she was no longer waiting for permission to be exactly what she already was, and that in the end was the only reversal that had ever mattered.